Hi everybody, and welcome to our online unit on the preschool years, or what we sometimes call early childhood. In this unit we're going to be talking about kids from about 2 years of age to about 6 years of age. And 2 as a beginning point shouldn't be surprising to you, right? I mean, we've already established that, kind of on average, if you will, infancy ends around age 2. Age 6 is the upper limit of the preschool period, plus or minus a year, because usually, at least in most industrialized countries, by age 6 we have kids going off to school. And one of the reasons that 6 is a time when they do go off to school is that there's quite a cognitive jump around age 6. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more in the next unit. But suffice it to say that cognitively they're much more ready for schooling and sitting at a desk and things like that once they get to somewhere between 5 and 7 years of age. All right, so as we talk about physical development, we are going to return to a discussion of brain development, although we won't be talking so much about cellular level this time. You remember when we talked about infancy, we talked about changes at the cellular level, right? Myelination and synaptogenesis and synaptic pruning. Well, those processes continue, but they start to get a little bit more specific in terms of what areas of the brain they're occurring in. So we'll take a look at different areas of the brain. And then we will move on to 2 applications of physical development, one being a more fine motor application of artistic development, and another being a little bit more of a gross motor application, athletic development. So I'd like to introduce you to some areas of our brain. As you might know, the brain is really kind of divided up into subunits, if you will, or sections that answer for various capacities. And on this slide, I'm going to just kind of verbally introduce you to these areas, and then on the next slide we'll see a map of the brain so you can kind of get a sense of where they are. I'll say, though, right off the bat that I will not make you identify the location of these areas in the brain. I just think seeing where they're located will be interesting, and it might be helpful in remembering some of the areas that we talk about. And the areas we're going through here are areas that continue to see a fair amount of development cellularly, I guess if you can that, during the preschool period. Okay, so let's take a look at these. You see the word cortex in the first couple of items there. The cortex is what we often think of as the brain. It's the upper layer that's kind of gray and wrinkled. Although underneath it, of course, there are other areas that are not cortex areas, as we'll talk about. All right, but the frontal cortex, as the name suggests, is basically that area of our brain that's kind of behind our forehead. It's in the front of the brain. And when mature, it seems to help with higher order thinking. And by higher order thinking, we mean, those kinds of relatively demanding thinking processes, planning and logical thought and analysis and things like that, not simply, memory of facts or something like that. Okay, so we do see some in the frontal cortex in the preschool period. That being said, it's not going to be really until the teen years or even a little bit later when the frontal cortex is completely mature. But kids do start to kind of plan a little bit better over the course of the preschool period, so they start to see a little bit of development in this area. Okay, the motor cortex is also a part of that upper layer of the brain, and it controls motor function on the other side of the body. Well, what does that mean? You're going to see that the motor cortex is basically a strip of tissue running from one ear over the top of the head to the other ear. And so you've got, very clearly kind of the 2 sides. You've got the left portion of it and the right portion of it. And as you may already know, what happens is when, the cells that control, say, arm in the left motor cortex fire, it is actually our right arm that is raised, or that throws a punch or does whatever. So we seem to be cross-wired in that way. And we're going to talk a little bit about that development of skills on different sides of the body here in just a little bit, because it really starts to kick in the preschool period. One of the most obvious examples of that is handedness. Babies, as they get to the infancy, often will start to show a preference for one hand over the other, but early in infancy, they usually don't. Okay, so we'll have more to say about that in just a little bit. The cerebellum is a structure that actually exists at the back and base of the brain. So if you were to kind of put your hand where your spinal column comes up into your skull, it's kind of right around there. Okay, and the cerebellum, it's kind of interesting. It's been getting a lot of press lately, and we're finding out it's responsible for a lot more than we thought it was. But what we've long known it's responsible for is helping in the control of movement. The timing of movement, integrating different movements together. So when I walk, can I swing my opposite arm when one leg goes forward, things like that. Balance, stuff like that. So the cerebellum is not the only thing involved in movement, but it's a very important part of our movement system. And we will see when we get to talking about athletic development that kids just blossom during the preschool period in terms of their motor skills. And one of the reasons really are these last two bullets that we've just talked about, the development in the motor cortex and the cerebellum. Okay, the reticular formation is a part of the brain that is actually fairly deep inside the brain. You wouldn't see it if you were just looking at a brain, in a laboratory or something like that. And among other things, it's responsible for, very involved in attentional processes. And, one of the reasons that we don't send 3-year-olds to school full day is that they have a hard time paying attention. And one of the main reasons for that, as far as we understand, is that the reticular formation is really still developing during these early years. Okay, second to last, we have Broca's area, which is actually in the frontal cortex, as we'll see. And Broca's area and the last item there, Wernicke's area, are both very closely involved in speech. See, there's still a lot of language a lot of language development happening during the preschool period. And perhaps not surprisingly, there's continued development in these areas. Now, I've oversimplified things here, but for our purposes, we're going to say that Broca's area is responsible for speech production, right? So for actually putting together sentences that make sense. And being able to enunciate words and so forth, whereas Wernicke's area seems to be responsible for speech comprehension. And I think that'll make a little bit of sense once we move on to the next slide, and you can see where these areas are located. So here we have a brain, right? With some sections colored in. As I'm sure you probably know, we don't actually have colored sections in our brain. This is actually only half the brain. It is the left half, and so on the left side of the slide there, if you can imagine kind of a skull, and on top of the brain you would see, underneath the brain there, eyes and a nose and things like that. And one of the reasons that we know this is the left side is that Broca's area and Wernicke's area are here. And in almost everybody, these areas are located in the left hemisphere. Okay, so, let's just talk about the different areas that we just talked about. Okay, the frontal cortex, unfortunately, is not marked here. But it is that gray area, and including the blue spot that's Broca's area, in front of the yellow portion of the brain, or the portion that is colored yellow here. Okay, so that whole frontal part on the left third or so of the slide is the cortex. The motor cortex here is marked. It is that yellow portion, And again, it basically goes from one ear over the top of the head to the other ear. So there, if we could see the right side of the brain, there would be a corresponding yellow section on the other side as well. Okay, the cerebellum also is not marked, but it is that red kind of roundish area that is located in the lower right-hand corner. Okay, and so there's kind of one lobe that you can see there, and if we could see the right-hand side of the brain, we would see a corresponding lobe there. Okay, so it's quite far back in the brain. What else do we have? The reticular formation you can't see here because it's kind of deep inside the brain, but you can see the brainstem there at the bottom. And if you followed that brainstem up kind of into the center of the brain, as you were going up the brainstem into the center of the brain, you would run across the reticular formation. And then we've already mentioned Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area, you will note, is quite close to that orange blob there, which is labeled the auditory cortex. And if you were to put a skull and skin on this person here, you would probably realize that that's right behind the ear. And remember, we said Wernicke's area seems to be particularly involved in speech comprehension, so it's probably not surprising that it is located right near the ear. And again, these two areas, Broca's areas and Wernicke's area, usually only on the left side of the brain. We're going to be talking a little bit about brain lateralization, or the sidedness of the brain. Having two sides and each side being different. This is really one of the first suggestions we get of that. Our language area, for the most part, are located in the left side of the brain. So we've introduced the idea that the two sides of the brain are not identical. Let's flesh that out a little bit and talk about why it's relevant to a discussion of brain development in the preschool years. This idea that the two sides of the brain are not equivalent it is basically the same idea as lateralization. In other words, that's like the term that we use to describe this phenomenon. Okay, so as you see there, lateralization is the process by which certain functions develop more in one hemisphere or one half of the brain than the other. Okay, so as the brain continues to develop from infancy into the preschool period, the right and the left hemisphere, the right and left side of the brain, are becoming more and more different from each other. And we've already looked at one example of that. The language centers for most people are, for the most part, exclusively in the left brain or the left side brain. Now, there are some gender differences and just some individual differences in that. It seems that women are not quite as lateralized as men, so their left and right hemispheres look a bit more like each other, relatively speaking, than men's do. And then, of course, any given person is going to have their own unique brain organization. Often when we do research on the brain, we select only right-handed people because, interestingly enough, right-handed people have a more predictable brain organization than lefties. So there's some other factors that are thrown in there that don't make this an ironclad rule that language, for example, will just be in the left hemisphere. But it does tend to be the case that there are certain characteristics typically in one side of the brain or the other. And this is what we refer to as, left brain, right brain. You may have seen quizzes online or what have you. Do you have a left brain personality or a right brain personality? The whole idea of a left or right brain personality is kind of silly. The brain is almost always operating as one whole, but there are scientific ways, and we'll see this in a video in just a little bit, that you can kind of isolate what the right hemisphere is doing and what the left hemisphere is doing. And when we do that, we do find differences. For example, the left side of the brain, as we've said, tends to be more linguistically oriented, language oriented. It has a characteristic way of going about problem solving, which is a bit more analytical than the right side of the brain. The left hemisphere kind of loves, it's very sciencey, I guess we might say, in the way that it approaches information. Loves to be analytical, systematic. So if you've ever studied the scientific method in your biology class, or if you're in psychology, you certainly will have to take those kinds of classes. That kind of problem-solving process that is very logical and systematic is what we find the left side of the brain doing with information. The right side of the brain, on the other hand, tends to be a specialist in identifying faces, in looking at information in a more holistic fashion. And by holistic, I mean it looks at the entire pattern of information rather than little bits of information inside the pattern. Okay, and one way that we can kind of understand this and how this is different than the left side of the brain is by thinking about faces. If you look at somebody's face, you recognize them based on the pattern of their face. You're looking at all aspects of their face at the same time. You're looking at their face as a whole. That's very right-brained in its orientation. What the left brain would do, if it were left to its own devices, is take a look first at one eye and then the other eye, independent of the first eye. Then it might look at each of the nostrils, right? And then the lips. But that's so specific and analytical that you're never going to get a sense of who you're looking at if that's the way you approach things. So the right brain tends to be oriented towards visual patterns, and again, more holistic in its approach to information. It likes to synthesize or bring together pieces of information. Okay. Although we have evidence of some degree of lateralization from very early in life, as the brain continues to develop in the preschool period, this effect of the left and the right brain being different becomes much more noticeable as we do specialized testing in the lab. We also see the body becoming more and more lateralized over the preschool period. I think we've already mentioned the idea of handedness, which tends to develop pretty early in the preschool period. As you may or may not know, you're not only handed, but you're also legged, right? I mean, you prefer one leg over the other if you think about how you play kickball or soccer. That should become obvious. You also have a dominant eye, right? I mean, all of us have one eye that tends to be the orienting eye that we work by, I guess you might say. And you can tell what eye that is. There's a couple of different ways that you can do it, but one way you can do it is by holding your thumb up and your arm out in front of your face at, completely stretched out, and have your thumb cover something, whether it's the light fixture on the wall or maybe a little bit of crack in the wall. Just find an item and have your thumb cover it. Okay, both eyes open. And then what you need to do, keeping your hand stretched out and your thumb covering whatever item it is sequentially close one eye, open it, and then close the other. So, maybe first you close your left eye, okay, and then you open it up, and then you close your right eye, and then you open it up. And when you close one of those eyes, your thumb should appear to move off the item that it's covering. So let's say you've got your thumb covering up the light fixture on your wall, and you blink your left eye and nothing happens. Your thumb pretty much stays there. And then you blink your right eye and your thumb appears to move off the light fixture. Well, whichever eye you blinked that led to your thumb moving off the item, that is your dominant eye. Okay, because your thumb appears to move because you had oriented your visual interaction with the world by that eye that you are now closing. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. We can try it in class when we get back together again if you're feeling a little fuzzy about it. Your dominant eye is not always your strongest eye. For example, my right eye is actually far worse, well, not far worse, but I have a stronger prescription for my right eye than I do for my left eye, but it is my dominant eye. So all of this becomes noticeable during the preschool period. But again, I want to emphasize that the brain really works as a whole, and it works as a whole because of a structure called the corpus callosum, that is a series of fibers, a network of fibers that runs between the two hemispheres, and it connects them. And so although a piece of information, you reach out your left hand and you touch a fabric, the texture of that fabric, instantaneously almost is in your right hemisphere if you've touched it with your left hands, but almost as instantaneously that information has been shot over to the left hemisphere. So really your brain works together as a whole, unless there's a problem with your corpus callosum. And what I'd like to do now is ask you to click on the link and go see the video, which will talk a little bit about lateralization in general, and we'll show you some pretty amazing experiments with a man who has had his corpus callosum split for health-related reasons. Interestingly enough, even though they have cut that network of fibers and this man's hemispheres are no longer connected, he's able to live a fairly normal life. But under conditions of like specialized testing, you can really see the difference between the left and the right hemisphere. Take a look at that video. We're now going to turn to the first of two topics that is kind of an application, if you will, of some of the changes that are happening in the brain. The first will be a fine motor application, and we're going to talk a little bit about artistic development. And just to refresh your memory, of course, we've got changes in the motor cortex, we've got changes in the cerebellum, and both of those are going to have implications for how well kids are moving, not only in a gross motor situation, but also in a fine motor situation. Okay, so art is something that most young people, at least in Western cultures, are interested in. I can't even imagine that there would be a household where a child hasn't taken a pen or a crayon or something and scribbled, perhaps not where they should be scribbling, maybe on a wall or something like that, or ideally a piece of paper. In addition, many of you, I hope, will have a chance to interact with, a young child as a part of your observation project, and especially if you are actually interacting with them and not just observing. Doing art can be kind of a fun thing to do, and heck, you might even end up with something that you can write about in your project. All right, so let's take a look at these stages of artistic development. If you put a crayon in the hand of a toddler, you might get something on a piece of paper, but chances are, well, first of all, chances are it won't be anything that you recognize, probably more, as you see here, just scribbles. And secondly, chances are that you will notice that it's really more of a gross motor movement than a fine motor movement, right? They might grasp the crayon with their entire fist, right? And then as they scribble, it's almost more like they're scribbling maybe from the elbow or the shoulder. So when we think of drawing, we usually think of, holding an instrument, a crayon or a pen, with your fingers and very kind of carefully and delicately, tracing out a design or something like that. That's really far too much fine motor skill. And far too much coordination for a child before the preschool period. Okay, so we might refer to that as the scribble stage. As kids move into the preschool period, they do start to mimic some of the general shapes that they see in the environment. Usually by about age 3, you've got kids, maybe drawing circles, squares. Now, these are not going to be perfect circles or perfect squares. They'll probably be kind of wobbly, but at least, it's fairly clear that they're trying to mimic some kind of shape. And soon after that, they start to combine shapes to produce more complex designs. We call this the design stage. Okay. So it's same idea as the shape stage, it's just more complicated because you've got more shapes there. So they might add several different shapes to a piece of paper. The thing that the scribble, shape, and design stage have in common is that the drawings at all of these stages are what we would call non-representational or pre-representational. And by non or pre-representational, what we mean is that from kind of an adult perspective, it's not clear that the child is trying to represent anything specific that they've seen in the environment. So you might get a square, for example, and aside from looking like a square, it doesn't look like anything else. And, if you were to say to a child, oh, what what a great drawing, you might hear something like, yeah, it's you, Mommy, which is a little surprising if it's just a square. But that's because, again, it's pre-representational. It doesn't necessarily look like what it's intended to be. That changes when kids, kind of the latter half of the preschool period, get to the pictorial stage. Drawing at this stage becomes representative and more or less identifiable. Often they are still, way off on many issues that are related to art, such as perspective and, not foreshadowing. What's the word? You represent the foreground. Never mind. Forget it. I'm forgetting my art terms. Anyway, so these are not going to be, super awesome, whatever, art institute level drawings, but at least they will be representative. Okay, so what I'd like for us to do is we're going to move on to the next slide, which is actually a drawing by a young friend of mine. And I think she was about 3-ish or so when she drew this. And I just want you to take a look at it and we'll kind of analyze it, see if we can't figure out where she is in these stages, and see what you think. All right, so here's my friend Morgan's drawing. Why don't you take a look at it and think about, where would you place her in the 4 stages that we've just talked about? And what do you think it is, if it's anything? Clearly we have some scribbling going on there in the middle, but that being said, there's more going on than just scribble. So I would not put her at the scribble stage here. We know, of course, in our own lives that, we're well beyond the scribble stage, even if you can only draw stick people, but you can still scribble. So once you move beyond a stage, it doesn't mean you lose that capacity, but you just start to incorporate other things into your drawing. So she's beyond the stage. At the very least, she's in the shape stage. Maybe we might even say the design stage, since she's kind of combining different elements. And in fact, I've shown this picture now for several years, and occasionally, sometimes students even get it right, what she was trying to draw. So she might even be kind of on the border between design and pictorial. So probably, well, I need to have taken data to know exactly what students have said, but I don't know for sure what the breakdown is in terms of what students have identified this is. But every once in a while, maybe once a year or so, we'll get a student or two who gets it right. This is a whale. Okay, you may have identified it as a whale. So Morgan intended it to be something. It's not immediately obvious necessarily what it is. I've had students answer dolphins, which is certainly getting pretty close. And I think those scribbles may actually, maybe they're supposed to be like a fin or something like that. So, she's getting pretty close to being pictorial, although maybe not quite exactly there. Anyway, if you are interacting with kids who are, anywhere between, say, 2 and 6 or so as a part of your observation project, you might consider asking them to draw you something and see if you can identify what stage the child is at. That would make a very nice reflection. If you do that, though, I would ask you to either describe in some detail what they drew, or to actually, append either the picture itself, or maybe you can take a picture of the picture or something like that, so I can see exactly what it looks like. Okay, let's move on to a little bit more information about kids and art. All right, so once kids are drawing representationally, it's not at all unusual for them to want to draw people. People are, of course, very important in their lives, and so often their drawings contain some representation of people. And I want to talk a little bit about their first representations of people, because it's kind of an interesting case study in the interaction between physical skills and cognitive skills. And we're going to call this the puzzle of tadpole people. If you are an art therapy person and you've already taken the Intro to Art Therapy class, you may know these as cephalopods. All right, so depending on kind of what area you're studying children's development in, you kind of come across these different names. Anyway, when kids are first drawing people, they often will get the face in there, sometimes with detail on the face, often with detail on the face. Often they will have appendages, in other words, arms, legs, or some subsection thereof. But often they lack a torso, they lack a middle section. Let's move on to the next slide and I'll show you an example from that self-same Morgan who drew the supposed whale, right, in the previous slide, and we'll talk a little bit about what might be going on. Okay, so here we see Morgan's tadpole person, really aptly named because of all four appendages. She really only got one, so I guess that person has one leg, I assume. Sometimes you'll get them with the arms kind of coming out of the middle, the central area of the face, kind of one out to each side and the two legs at the bottom. If you're lucky, you get all four appendages. But I would just call your attention to this. I mean, you notice that we've got a fair amount of detail on the face. Obviously, we've got eyes, and the eyes even seem to maybe have eyelashes or something going on there. And then I guess we have a smile or a mouth of some sort. Maybe not a nose, but in any case, a fair amount of detail on the actual drawing itself. Let's talk a little bit about what might be going on here. Why do kids leave out the torso area and focus, as we see here, sometimes in a lot of detail, on other areas of the body? All right, so returning to the slide that we saw before Morgan's tadpole person, we're going to elaborate just a little bit, and we have some research on tadpole people or cephalopods and what might be going on here. The research is pretty clear. The few studies that have been done, this is not a perceptual problem. In other words, if you show young children who produce tadpole people pictures that other people have drawn, some of which might be tadpole people, others which would have a full torso area, for the most part, they pick the person with the torso area as the one that best represents a human being. So they seem to know that people have midsections, and yet they don't produce them often when they are drawing their first people. So what's going on with that? Well, you might think a little bit about that. Why might kids, just focus on faces and appendages? And there's probably a variety of different answers you could give. And I don't know that we have a ton of data that supports one interpretation over the other, but we can generate some ideas. One thing might be that whether they're looking at themselves, right, or whether they're looking at somebody else, probably the most obvious things are going to be faces and appendages. Now, they can see their own appendages really easily. They know that mom and dad pick them up with arms. And, of course, other people's faces are very, very significant to kids. I think we've already talked about, at least in one of the sections, that even, newborn babies, one of the things that they prefer to look at most of all are faces, and in particular, of course, mom's face. So faces are very important to kids from the get-go. When kids are in the preschool period, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we get to our discussion of cognitive development, they seem to have a hard time really dividing their attention between different aspects of a person or a situation or an object. Their attention often really gets commanded by one or just a few aspects of an object. So, for example, Morgan seems to really be attuned to eyes in particular, right? I mean, it's kind of like she's spent all of her 3-year-old attention just kind of getting those eyes down, and the rest of it kind of falls apart in some ways. We're going to see that kids do this, have this kind of limitation in dividing their attention in many different areas. And so part of what might be going on with tadpole people is that their attention is so grabbed simply by faces and maybe to a lesser extent appendages like arms and legs that the torso, although we know it's important, it has all of our vital organs, it doesn't seem to do anything if you just look at it. So it just may not be seemingly important enough to really grasp their attention. All right, so it's kind of an interesting potential intersection between fine motor skills that have allowed them to progress to a representational phase in drawing, and yet cognitive skills that may be limiting the degree to which they can really accurately represent something. All right, so again, if you're hanging out with, 2 to 6 year olds as a part of your observation project, maybe you can get them to do some drawings and see some of these concepts literally illustrated right before your eyes. Let's move on to a discussion of gross motor skill development in the preschool period. Okay, so our last topic in physical development is an example of gross motor skill development looking at athletic skills. And we've got some video clips here of cute toddlers on YouTube, basically demonstrating what kids are like as they enter into the preschool period in these various areas. And then, as you see, the main point below there, and this is the main thing from this slide that I want you to get, is that children start the preschool period very immature, as you'll see in some of these video clips. But by the time they get to age 6 or so, they are quite adult-like. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through some of these specific skills. Okay, so we see major developments in most of these areas of gross motor skill that could also be considered athletic skills, or pre-athletic skills, I guess, in walking and running, right? So at the dawn of the preschool period, so like kind of around 2 years of age, maybe a little bit before, you often see kids, being still fairly awkward and uncoordinated, especially in running. You'll take a look at this video that's of a little boy running, and you'll notice that his arms are kind of flapping to the side. He kind of uses them more for balance, it seems, rather than helping him, run kind of more faster and aerodynamically like we might as adults. You'll notice his legs are they're not stiff, but they're not as flexible and elastic, I guess, as we might have them as we're running. So he's a nice example of how kids in late infancy, are managing this one particular gross motor skill of walking and running. And of course, I think you all know, by the time you hit age 6 or so, well before that really, probably by 3, 4 or so, walking and running skills look very much like they would for us. For all of these skills, what's really required is a lot of coordination. Even though running and hopping, are basically lower body skills, you still have to do a lot with your upper body. Okay, and although throwing and catching are upper body skills in many ways, you still have to coordinate a lot with your lower body. And you'll notice as you watch these videos, that's something that these kids don't seem to do very well. All right, so we have a video of a little boy running. There's also a cute little video of a little girl jumping and hopping down a hallway. And, again, just notice kind of how uncoordinated she is. If we jump or hop, imagine yourself doing a jump ball during a basketball game. You crouch down, you've got your elbows pulled back, and then you kind of have your whole body kind of leap into the jump. You'll notice that she's just not doing that. Okay. And then we have a video on throwing and catching. And I would encourage you to watch this one for about 1 minute and 30 seconds. The first two you can watch for just about 30 seconds. So you don't have to watch the whole thing. But notice as the little boy is throwing this ball, for him, it's just kind of like dropping it or pushing it away from himself rather than any kind of coordinated throw. And then, in those situations where he's actually trying to catch the ball, notice that he kind of gets in one position and he's just not kind of quick and coordinated enough to move his body however it needs to be moved to actually catch the ball. He kind of just gets in one position and stays there. I don't have any videos for pedaling and steering. Suffice it to say that although kids can, usually pedal in one direction, sometimes in the early part of the preschool period, the idea that pedaling forward to go and pedaling backward to stop can be kind of confusing. So they might just kind of take off down the street and not stop until they hit your neighbor's hedge. Steering and pedaling at the same time can be a little bit difficult. In some ways, it's kind of the same principle we saw with the tadpole people. I mean, that requires concentration on two kind of very different processes, right? Pedaling is kind of up and down with the legs, steering is more side to side with the arms. And so again, for a toddler, somebody just getting into the preschool period, that can be a lot to coordinate. Okay, so take a look at these videos, and then again, from this slide, the main thing I want you to get is just that main point. The early preschoolers, so those who are around 2 or so, are still quite immature in their gross motor skills. Yes, they can walk, yes, they can run, they can do some basic hopping and so forth, but they are not coordinating their body near to the degree that they will be even just a year or two later as they get into the main part and the latter part of the preschool period. Take a look at these